Hey folks, it's Coach Kelvin here from the We Run Virtual Run Club and We Run Coach for Leeds and surrounding areas, as well as online coaching. In this little video, I'd like to just reflect on something that I mentioned in the last video, and that was when we're talking about sort of measuring and monitoring progression. It's about we mentioned about doing time trials to perceived effort, and I want to just take a little pause and just sort of touch upon perceived effort in a little bit more detail. And the reason for that is running to perceived effort is a skill, and it's something that it's wise to practice in your training, same as a lot of things in training, over and over and over again. And not just kind of doing it, but also taking some time to reflect on that. So perceived effort, the way that I see perceived effort, I think perceived effort as a sort of single metric, like a perceived effort of 7, threshold is a perceived effort of 7, is very sort of one-dimensional. And what I like to do is add other dimensions into things like perceived effort and other metrics in training. So we're almost kind of like triangulating different metrics to get a sort of average, like things like pace against heart rate. So when it comes to perceived effort, something that a lot of people don't take into consideration is duration. And what I mean by that, I'm going to use a marathon runner as an example. And I'm actually going to use Sarah Hall as an example after yesterday's American Olympic trials, where she got 5th and had an amazing run. And I'm quite sure that if you'd have asked Sarah after 5K into the marathon, what is your perceived effort? She would have probably said like a 7, maybe even like a low 7. And if you'd have asked Sarah in the last 5K, it would have been the absolute top end of 10, seen across the finish line and just kind of collapsing on the floor. So I think that's a really good example, and I'm sure we can all relate to this when, we maybe do an interval session and we go out on the first interval and we know that let's take threshold as an example. I did a threshold session the other day that was like 5 times 1200 meter hills, and it's quite easy to go out and think, okay, well, threshold is probably a kind of like low 7, maybe even the middle of a 7 in terms of perceived rate of perceived exertion. I know what my breathing rate needs to be and all of those things, but it's still really, really easy to go out way too hot on pace on the first interval. So I'm sure we've all experienced that before, whether it's in like an interval session, a workout, or a race, where after the first kind of 25 to 30% of the workout or race, we've just gone like, oh dear, I'm gonna have to like ease this back a little bit and try recover because this pace is not sustainable. And that's because we've maybe gone out on the sort of average perceived effort. So what I try to do when I'm doing my between 4 and 6 times 1200 meter hills threshold session, I want the perceived effort of that session to be like it's quite short for threshold, so I probably want that to be maybe a 7, maybe even a high 7. For that session. So what I want to do is I want to do the first rep at like a low 7, and then maybe the next rep at a low 7, and then the next rep is going to feel more like a high 7, and then another high 7, and then maybe like 1 or 2 where it's actually going to feel like an 8 in terms of perceived effort, whereas 8 is feeling more like VO2 max when it comes to the rate of perceived exertion. So we've got to take that into the equation. We can't just go, I'm going to run this like time trial, interval session or race at a rate of perceived exertion at a high 8 because it's a 5K. If we set off at a high 8 when we're still feeling quite fresh, we're going to blow up quite quickly in that race. So that's just something to bear in mind, that when we run in and we run into rate of perceived exertion, that we add the other layer into the equation, which is time spent at that perceived effort. And bear in mind that we're looking for an average perceived effort over the duration of the interval session or the race, and bearing in mind that it's going to feel considerably easier at the start and considerably harder rather at the end. So I hope that makes some sort of sense, and if you have any questions or thoughts on this, please just pop them down in the comments below. And for now, happy running!